On the night of July 26, 2022, 16-year-old Susana Morales went missing without a trace. Her family, desperate for answers, spent months searching for her, but it wasn't until 6 months later, in February 2023, that her remains were found. The discovery of her body left the town reeling, especially when the investigation revealed that the person responsible for her disappearance was someone we're supposed to trust. A police officer sworn to serve and protect now stands accused of a crime that's far beyond what anyone could have imagined. This is the Susana Morales case. Let's get into it. Welcome to Slice of Darkness. This is your host, Alyssa, and today we're covering a case that forces us to question the very people we're supposed to trust with our safety. 16-year-old Susana Morales was born on June 24, 2006. She was the youngest in her family and lived with her mother, Maria, and her stepfather, Leo. She had 2 older sisters, Jasmine and Jalissa, and a stepbrother whom she absolutely adored. She was especially close to Jasmine, and the bond they shared was incredibly strong. During the summer of 2022, Susana was living in Norcross, Georgia, and had just finished her freshman year at Meadow Creek High School. She was a cheerleader, well-liked by her classmates, and had a natural talent for music. She loved singing and had been teaching herself to play both the guitar and the ukulele. While she enjoyed hanging out with her friends, she was also very family-oriented. On the afternoon of July 26, 2022, Susana returned home around 4 p.m. after spending the day at work with her mom. Since it was summer break, she would sometimes go along to earn a little extra cash. A couple of hours later, around 6 p.m., she left to visit a friend who lived at the Sterling Glen Apartments, just a short distance from her house on Santa Ana Drive. When she arrived, she sent her mom a text to let her know she had made it safely. Later that night, at 9:40 p.m., she messaged again, saying she'd be heading home soon. At around 10 p.m., she left her friend's apartment and started walking back, but she never made it home. As time passed and there was still no sign of Susana, her mother, Maria, became increasingly worried. She called her daughter's phone multiple times, but there was no answer. When the sun came up the next morning and Susana still wasn't home, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. Her phone had been turned off, which only made things more concerning. This wasn't typical behavior for her. She wasn't the kind of teenager to just disappear without telling anyone. By 9 a.m., Maria contacted the Gwinnett Police Department, pleading for help. It had been almost 12 hours since Susana had last been heard from. But instead of taking immediate action, the police told her she had to wait 48 hours before filing a missing person report. They brushed it off, saying teenage girls often run away, sneak out to party, or leave with their boyfriends. No matter how much her family insisted that Susana wasn't like that, the authorities refused to act. And this is what's so frustrating about cases like this. We know that the first 48 hours in a missing person case are the most critical. That's when searches need to be happening. Leads need to be followed, and efforts need to be at their highest. But instead of treating it with urgency, the police dismissed the family's concerns and did nothing. Refusing to wait around, Susana's family immediately started their own search. They printed flyers, knocked on doors, posted online, and asked anyone and everyone if they had seen her. Thankfully, one of their neighbors had security footage showing Susana walking toward her neighborhood around 10 p.m. The location where she was last seen was only about a minute away from her home. For her family, this was proof that she was on her way home that night. They brought the footage to the police, thinking this would finally get them to take the case seriously. But even with video evidence, law enforcement still wasn't convinced. Susana had clearly not run away. Her family was presenting solid proof that she had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Yet the police still didn't treat it as an emergency. If that wasn't enough, what came next should have erased all doubt. Either her family or the police, there are conflicting reports on this, checked the location data from a tracking app on her phone. What they discovered made it undeniably clear that something had happened to her. Between 10:07 p.m. and 10:21 p.m., her phone data showed her walking along Singleton Road. Then, within just 5 minutes, between 10:21 p.m. and 10:26 p.m., her phone suddenly pinged in an entirely different area, Oak Lock Trace, near Steve Reynolds Boulevard. There was no way she could have traveled that distance on foot in such a short amount of time. This meant that someone had to have picked her up. Her family knew it. Anyone who looked at the evidence would know it. But still, the police refused to acknowledge the severity of the situation. So now, not only was Susana missing, but her family was left to do everything on their own. They were the ones searching for answers, following leads, and spreading awareness. For the next month, they worked tirelessly to get people to notice Susana's case. They reached out to the media, plastered her face on social media, and did everything possible to keep her name out there. Eventually, some news stations like Telemundo Atlanta started covering her story, helping spread awareness within the local Hispanic community. Soon, Susana's case started gaining attention on TikTok, with people sharing her story and demanding answers. Despite all of this, it felt like law enforcement still wasn't doing enough. They had a missing person report, surveillance footage, and phone data that clearly showed something was wrong. Yet nothing was being done. And sadly, this was only the beginning of Susana's case. It wasn't until August 29th, over a month after Susana disappeared, that the police finally acknowledged her case publicly. They put out a statement saying detectives had exhausted all leads and needed help from the community. But in that same statement, they also said, and I quote, "While any missing juvenile is considered endangered, at this time there is no indication that Morales is in any specific danger, and it is not believed that she is being held against her will." And honestly, it felt like they only spoke up because they had no choice. Her family refused to stop searching, and public pressure was growing with every social media post, news article, and interview. But the way the police framed it was beyond disappointing. They made it seem like this was just another case of a runaway teen, downplaying the obvious red flags. A 16-year-old had been missing for over a month with zero contact. Her phone had been off the entire time, going straight to voicemail. That alone should have been enough to raise alarm bells. But instead of treating it as a serious situation, they acted like there was nothing to worry about. And that just doesn't make sense. Sure, teenagers sometimes turn off their phones when they're sneaking out or avoiding their parents, but that wasn't the case here. Susana had permission to be out. She was walking toward home. And let's be real, what 16-year-old willingly keeps their phone off for over a month? Even if it had died, she would have charged it at some point, whether to message her friends, scroll through social media, or just check in. On top of that, school had already been in session for 3.5 weeks by the time the police finally admitted she was missing. She wasn't some rebellious kid skipping class. She was a cheerleader, a good student, someone who had never just vanished like this before. How did none of this raise red flags for law enforcement? Susana's older sister, Jasmine, did an interview the day after the police finally made their statement. She talked about the frustration of not knowing anything, of just wanting answers. She said, "It's been over a month. Something happened between the spot where we have surveillance footage and our neighborhood. That's just a minute apart. Something happened in that 1 minute, and we haven't been able to figure out what." The police, meanwhile, stuck to their stance that Susana was likely a runaway. They claimed they had followed every possible lead but had come up empty. But her family knew better. Jasmine made it clear. Susana wouldn't have left voluntarily. She wouldn't have gone this long without reaching out to her mom, her boyfriend, or at the very least, her sister. And yet, months passed with no real progress. Each time reporters followed up with the police, they would just repeat that they were looking into any new leads. But there were no actual breakthroughs. Thanksgiving came and went, then Christmas, then New Year's, and still nothing. No word from Susana. No new information from the police. Just silence. Her family, though? They never stopped searching. They followed up on every possible lead, even ones from out of state. They refused to sit back and do nothing, especially since they felt like the police had already failed them so many times. Then, in January of 2023, the police suddenly contacted Susana's family again. This time, they weren't asking for updates. They were asking for a DNA sample from her mother and requesting her dental records. For anyone unfamiliar, those are the kinds of things law enforcement typically request when they believe they may have found a body, not a missing person. A body. And just like that, the Morales family's worst fears grew even stronger. It was no longer just about finding Susana. It was about preparing for the possibility that she was never coming home. Still, the police didn't share any new details with the public, at least not right away. Then, on February 6, 2023, a call came in. Someone had stumbled upon human remains in a wooded area, completely unclothed. The location was over 20 miles away from Norcross, right on the border between Gwinnett and Barrow counties. Initially, police didn't confirm any connection to Susana's case. They also weren't sure if foul play had been involved. News stations started covering the discovery, and while many feared the worst, some still held on to hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't her. that she was still out there somewhere. The next day, law enforcement conducted a grid search of the area, hoping to find any clues. That's when they came across something unexpected, a gun, found not far from where the body had been. But here's the strange part. The body didn't show any signs of gunshot wounds. So while the gun might have been connected, there was no immediate way to tell how. Then, on February 8th, 2 days later, the police confirmed the news that her family had been dreading. The remains were officially identified as Susana Morales. Dental records left no doubt. Her family was shattered. Months of searching, pleading, and being ignored had led to this. They had known something was wrong from the very beginning. They had told the police that Susana wouldn't just disappear. And yet, time and time again, they were dismissed. Now, not only were they grieving the loss of their daughter and sister, but they were also left with a burning question. Who did this? Because Susana wasn't the kind of person who had enemies. She was kind, bright, and loyal to those she loved. So why would someone want to hurt her? Law enforcement was able to trace the gun found near the crime scene back to 22-year-old Miles Bryant, a former Army member and a police officer for the city of Doraville, just a town over from Norcross. The discovery was already shocking, but what made it even more alarming was that Miles had reported the gun stolen at 11 a.m. on July 27th, just 2 hours after Susana was reported missing. In his report, Miles claimed that someone had broken into his vehicle, stealing his gun, wallet, and military ID. He told officers he had accidentally left his trunk open, making it easy for someone to access his belongings. But as investigators started connecting the dots, Miles's story became more and more suspicious. It turned out that Miles lived at the Sterling Glen Apartments, the very same complex where Susana had visited her friend that night. Not only that, but he was also a courtesy officer for the apartment complex, and in a disturbing twist, his apartment had a clear view of Susana's home. With all these details not adding up, investigators made their move. On February 13th, Miles Bryant was arrested for concealing a death and filing a false police report. According to authorities, Miles had dumped Susana's body in the woods. His report about the stolen items? Completely fabricated. As police searched his car before towing it, neighbors saw officers removing a bedsheet, a small but chilling detail. Coincidentally, Miles's arrest happened on the very same day as Susana's funeral. Her family, already devastated, now had to process the horrifying revelation that a police officer was responsible for her disappearance and death. They had never heard of Miles before, and there was no known connection between him and Susana. Following his arrest, more disturbing allegations surfaced. A childhood friend of Miles, Alicia Bates, spoke to Fox 5 News, revealing that Miles had stalked her at her Snellville apartment just the year before. A Ring camera video from her neighbor showed him lurking outside her door, trying the doorknob while wearing a hood. She even recalled a time when her neighbor warned her that Miles had been listening at her door when she wasn't home. Eventually, he broke in, and fearing for her life, she reported him to both Doraville and Gwinnett police. But nothing was done.
Well, my neighbor told me that she saw Miles come into our community and listening to my door when I wasn't home and just trying to see if I was home, messing with my doorknob and stuff. She told me, and once she showed me the video of him, it was all alarming.
Doraville PD said they had talked to him, and the behavior supposedly stopped, but no real action was taken. Reflecting on Susana's fate, Alicia said, "If they had taken my complaint seriously, Susana might still be alive." And Alicia wasn't alone. Over time, 4 more women came forward with similar allegations, accusing Miles of stalking, breaking into homes, and even stealing personal belongings. One woman reported that back in 2018, Miles had stolen her underwear during a break-in, and yet, despite multiple reports, he was still allowed to serve as a police officer. On February 22nd, the Gwinnett Police Department held a press conference announcing that Miles's charges had been upgraded to felony murder and kidnapping. Investigators revealed that on the night of July 26th, Susana left her home around 6 p.m. to visit her friend at Sterling Glen Apartments. After spending about 4 hours there, she began walking home around 10 p.m. Sometime between 10 and 10:30 p.m., she crossed paths with Miles Bryant, and after that moment, she was never seen or heard from again. Miles appeared in court on the 23rd, where he was read his charges and denied bail. The judge ruled that he posed a danger to the community. In early March, Miles was charged with burglary related to a 2019 incident. A woman who had gone to high school with him had her home broken into while she was away. Surveillance footage captured someone walking around inside her house. Although the case was initially closed, it was reopened after Miles's arrest for his crimes against Susana. The woman, after seeing Miles in the media, was confident he was the one who had broken into her home. She went back to the police to report that she had never given him her address, and this time there was enough evidence to charge him. On May 1st, Miles returned to court, requesting a reduction in his bail. The prosecution came prepared, detailing how Miles used his position as a Dorval police officer to commit numerous crimes, including breaking into women's homes and stealing their underwear. In one disturbing incident, while on duty and in uniform, Miles accessed a woman's phone, claiming he needed it to log into his bank account. Instead, he secretly sent himself explicit videos from her phone. Despite his attorney's efforts to argue for a lower bail, the judge denied the request, ensuring that Miles would remain in jail. The police believe Susana's life was taken sometime between 10 p.m. on the 26th and 2 a.m. on the 27th. Tragically, by the time Susana's family filed a missing person report, she had already died. To this day, the exact cause of her death remains a mystery, though law enforcement has shared that they do not believe she was shot. They suspect that she was likely harmed and sexually violated before being killed and disposed of in the woods. While the timeline suggests that law enforcement might not have been able to prevent Susana's death, many believe they mishandled the case, which may have delayed finding her sooner. One of the biggest issues in the investigation was the Gwinnett Police Department's 48-hour waiting rule. According to Georgia law, police agencies are prohibited from having a mandated waiting period before filing a missing person report. Despite clear evidence that Susana's disappearance was out of character for her, the police took more than a month to publicly address her case. They had surveillance footage showing her heading home, and her phone had pinged in an area far from where she should have been. She missed weeks of school, and her phone remained off. These signs should have raised red flags, and it's concerning that law enforcement did not immediately treat the case as potentially involving foul play. In addition to their frustrations with the police, Susana's family also holds the Dorval Police Department accountable for failing to adequately vet Miles Bryant before hiring him. Family attorney Alex Northover recently spoke to the media, highlighting how the department failed to take corrective action despite multiple allegations of stalking against Miles. He emphasized that the city of Dorval should take full responsibility for their role in this tragedy and implement stricter hiring procedures, better screening, and comprehensive training to ensure no other family has to go through such an ordeal. Now, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What drives someone to commit a crime like this? What patterns of behavior stand out? And are there any warning signs that could have been recognized earlier? In this next part, we're diving into the criminal psychology behind Miles Bryant's actions and what it tells us about offenders like him. Disclaimer: the following analysis is based on publicly available information and should not be interpreted as a professional psychological evaluation. We are not psychologists, and this discussion is intended to provide insight into the behavior of Miles Bryant from a general perspective, not a clinical one. Miles Bryant's actions in this case reveal some deeply disturbing patterns in criminal psychology, especially when it comes to offenders who hold positions of authority. As a police officer, he wasn't just someone the community was supposed to trust. He was in a position that gave him both access and a sense of control. That's something we see in offenders who abuse power. They hide in plain sight, using their authority as a shield, making it easier to manipulate situations, and in some cases, their victims. What makes this case even more unsettling is the pattern of behavior leading up to Susana's death. Before this, Miles had already been involved in crimes like stalking, burglary, and voyeurism, offenses that, when left unchecked, often escalate. He had a disturbing habit of breaking into homes, stealing personal items, and violating women's privacy. This kind of progression is something that criminal psychologists have studied for years. It's not uncommon for offenders to start with what some might call smaller crimes, only to push further and further once they realize they can get away with it. And then there's the way he carried himself after the fact. His request to lower his bail so he could be released while awaiting trial despite the overwhelming evidence against him suggests a level of narcissism and entitlement. It's a common trait among offenders like him. They believe they're smarter than the system, that they can manipulate their way out of consequences. But when you look at his history, it's clear that his actions were never impulsive. He was calculated, he had a pattern, and he was willing to go to extreme lengths to get what he wanted. Cases like this remind us why it's so important to pay attention to warning signs. Crimes like stalking and burglary aren't just isolated incidents. they can be precursors to something much worse. And when the person committing them is someone meant to uphold the law, it raises an even bigger question: how many other predators are hiding behind a badge believing they're untouchable? As the case against Miles Bryant continues to unfold, Susana's family remains hopeful that justice will ultimately be served. However, this case has raised important questions about how missing children of color are treated by law enforcement. Many residents of Gwinnett County are now questioning whether these cases receive the same level of attention and urgency as those involving children from more privileged backgrounds. Several Hispanic children have gone missing in the area, and many community members feel these cases were not taken seriously enough by the police. At a recent panel, Susana's family shared their grief and the unimaginable pain of losing a child, particularly under such horrific circumstances. They spoke out about the need for systemic change, not just within Gwinnett County, but across the country. Susana's family has become advocates for change and are pushing for reforms that would prevent other families from experiencing the same heartbreak. They've demanded that the police and government take responsibility for the lack of urgency shown in Susana's case, and for changes to be made to ensure that every missing child, regardless of race or background, is treated with the urgency and respect they deserve. This case is a heartbreaking reminder of the need for justice and accountability. No family should have to endure the pain that Susana Morales' loved ones have faced. And yet, her story raises an even bigger question: how many more victims are slipping through the cracks due to failures in the system? As her family continues to seek closure, it's clear that much more could have been done to prevent this tragedy. And that brings us to the end of today's case. If you have any information or thoughtful insights about this case, please let us know respectfully in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on future cases. And until next time, when we explore another bone-chilling case, right here on Slice of Darkness. Stay vigilant, stay safe,